Imagine standing in a silent hall lit only by flickering torches, the air heavy with incense. Before you stands a scale on one side, a feather of purest white. On the other, your heart, still pulsing with the weight of your life. Every lie, every kindness, every betrayal, it's all here, judged not by men, but by gods. One outcome grants you eternal paradise, the other condemns you to be devoured, erased forever. This is not myth to the ancient Egyptians. This was destiny. Welcome to the weighing of the heart, a journey into the afterlife as they truly believed it. In the imagination of ancient Egypt, the journey after death was not a quiet drifting into oblivion. It was a trial, a process as real and as serious as life itself. At the center of this belief stood the Hall of Ammit, a place both terrifying and hopeful, where every Egyptian, from the lowliest farmer to the most exalted pharaoh, would one day stand to have their soul judged. The Hall of Ammit was not a vague spiritual idea. It was described in detail within funerary texts, particularly in the Book of the Dead. These papyri, buried with the dead from the New Kingdom onward, painted images of a hall lined with deities, with Osiris enthroned at its center. On one side, the god Thoth, scribe of the gods, waited to record the outcome. Near the scales stood Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, carefully ensuring the fairness of the weighing. And in the shadows lurked Ammit, a fearsome composite creature, part lion, part crocodile, and part hippopotamus, the devourer of souls, ready to consume the heart of anyone found wanting. The trial was centered on a simple but profound test, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ammit. Ammit was not just a goddess, but a principle, the embodiment of truth, balance, justice, and order in the cosmos. Egyptians saw their entire civilization as dependent on Ammit. Pharaohs were described as the guardians of Ammit, rulers whose legitimacy came from their ability to uphold harmony between the divine, the natural, and the human. In life, Ammit shaped the order of the state and the daily rituals of its people. In death, it became the ultimate standard by which a soul was judged. The idea was that every deed a person performed in life, every word spoken, every thought harbored, was imprinted on their heart. The Egyptians called it the IB, a physical organ, but also the seat of thought, conscience, and morality. Unlike other cultures that might see judgment written in books or records, the Egyptians believed your own heart betrayed you. It was weighed directly, its heaviness or lightness revealing whether you had lived in accordance with Mahat. The imagery of the hall is preserved in vivid color on tomb walls and papyrus scrolls. In the Papyrus of Ani, one of the most complete and famous books of the dead, dating to around 1250 BCE, we see the deceased Ani led by Anubis toward the great scales. His heart is placed in one pan. The feather of Ammit, pure and light, rests in the other. Thoth waits to inscribe the verdict, while Ammit crouches eagerly at the side. Behind them, 42 gods of truth and justice look on, serving as divine witnesses. Finally, Osiris himself sits enthroned at the far end of the hall, flanked by his sisters Isis and Nephthys, ready to pronounce judgment. This was not an empty ritual. Egyptians truly believed that eternal destiny hung in the balance. If the scales tipped in favor of the feather, the heart was declared pure. The soul would then be permitted to join Osiris in the afterlife, entering the field of reeds, a paradise where existence mirrored the best of earthly life but perfected fertile fields, abundant harvests, eternal peace. If the heart was found heavy with sin, however, Ammit would devour it whole, condemning the soul to a second death, eternal annihilation, erased from existence. To the Egyptians, this fate was far worse than suffering. It meant non-being, the complete loss of identity. The Hall of Judgment reflected not only religious thought, but social order. For Egyptians, justice was not an abstract idea, was the foundation of the state. Mat was invoked in royal decrees, in law courts, and in everyday interactions. To lie, to cheat, to exploit others was not merely immoral, it was a violation of cosmic order. The afterlife judgment was the great equalizer. Wealth or power offered no advantage before the scales. Even pharaohs, considered divine in life, had to stand before Osiris and have their hearts weighed. Yet the Egyptians did not leave this terrifying process to chance. The Book of the Dead contained spells and prayers intended to prepare the soul. One of the most famous is the negative confession, also known as the Declaration of Innocence, where the deceased stands before the 42 assessors of Mat and proclaims, "Innocence of various sins. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not slain people. I have not caused pain." These were not mere recitations. They reflected the moral code of Egyptian society, a guide to living in harmony with Mat. By declaring such truths in life and in death, the soul reinforced its claim to righteousness. Archaeological discoveries have allowed us to reconstruct these beliefs with remarkable clarity. Tomb inscriptions from the Old Kingdom, dating back to around 2400 BCE, already hint at judgment scenes, though they were initially reserved for kings. Over time, access to the afterlife democratized, and by the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, even commoners had access to funerary texts, ensuring their passage. By the New Kingdom, the vision of the Hall of Mat had crystallized into the form we recognize today, a grand cosmic trial, recorded in elaborate papyri and painted on the walls of tombs in Thebes. What makes the Hall of Mat so striking is its profound sense of accountability. Unlike some ancient religions, where fate was arbitrary and the gods were inscrutable, the Egyptians saw a system of order and justice at work. Every soul, no matter who they were, faced the same trial. In this way, the Hall of Mat reflects a deeply human desire, the hope that the universe is fair, that good deeds are rewarded and wickedness punished. The rituals surrounding death reinforced this belief. Funerary rites were designed not only to preserve the body, but also to protect the heart from betrayal. Amulets, such as the heart scarab, were placed over the chest, inscribed with spells urging the heart not to testify against its owner. Spell 30B of the Book of the Dead famously pleads, "O my heart, do not stand up against me as a witness, do not oppose me before the keeper of the balance." Such texts reveal both the anxiety and the hope bound up in the judgment process. The hall itself may never have been a literal place, but a symbolic vision. Yet for Egyptians, its reality was unquestionable. It was painted in vivid colors in burial chambers, carved in stone reliefs, and inscribed on papyri carried by the dead. These images were not art for art's sake, they were functional. They served as a kind of map, guiding the deceased through the dangerous terrain of the afterlife and into the presence of Osiris. In the end, the Hall of Mat represents one of humanity's earliest and most enduring visions of moral accountability after death. It gave the Egyptians a structure of meaning that extended beyond life's uncertainties, assuring them that justice ultimately prevailed. The heart weighed against the feather symbolized the most fundamental question: had you lived in truth? Or had you lived in falsehood? For us today, this ancient scene remains. Powerful not because we believe in the same gods, but because the image of a heart on a scale continues to resonate. It speaks to a universal human concern that our actions matter, that our lives carry weight, and that, in the end, there is balance. For the people of ancient Egypt, death was never the end. It was a passage, a transition into another state of existence, and preparing for it was one of the defining features of their civilization. From the earliest dynasties to the last days of pharaonic rule, Egyptians devoted immense resources, time, and imagination to understanding and preparing for what lay beyond the grave. This obsession was not morbid. To them, death was not an enemy to be feared, but a mystery to be managed, controlled, and overcome. The foundations of this worldview can be traced back to the natural environment of Egypt, the Nile River, running through the heart of the desert, created a landscape defined by cycles of life and death. Every year, the river flooded, depositing fertile silt that made the land bloom. Villages and fields sprang back to life, only to wither under the sun until the waters returned again. To Egyptians, this cycle of inundation, decay, and rebirth became a metaphor for human existence. Just as the Nile's flood assured renewal, so too could the soul find rebirth after death. Archaeological evidence from the pre-dynastic period, before 3000 BCE, already shows signs of concern with the afterlife. Simple burials placed in shallow graves often included grave goods, pottery, tools, and food offerings. These objects were not casual inclusions. They reflected a belief that the dead continued to require sustenance and possessions, a foreshadowing of the elaborate tomb cultures that would later define Egypt. By the time the first dynasty emerged around 3100 BCE, the burial of kings involved monumental structures, servants, and treasures meant to accompany the ruler into eternity. At the core of this obsession was the belief in the Ka and the Bortu, essential aspects of the soul. The Ka was the vital life force, the energy that sustained a person in both life and death. It required food and drink, which is why offerings were left at tombs, and why false doors in tomb walls were created as portals for the Ka to receive nourishment. The Ba, on the other hand, was the personality, often depicted as a bird that could move freely between the worlds of the living and the dead. For a person to survive after death, both the Ka and the Ba had to be maintained and eventually reunited with the body. This made the preservation of the physical form, mummification, essential. Without the body, the soul could not be whole. The grand architecture of Egypt, from the mastabas of the Old Kingdom to the pyramids of Giza, reflects this fixation on eternity. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BCE, was not simply a tomb. It was a machine for resurrection, designed to align with the stars and the sun, ensuring the king's journey into the afterlife. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of royal burial chambers beginning in the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, reveal a detailed theology of rebirth. These spells and hymns invoke the gods to assist the pharaoh in ascending to the heavens, transforming into a star, and joining the sun god Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. But it was not only kings who prepared for eternity. Over centuries, access to the afterlife gradually expanded. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, non-royal elites began to inscribe coffin texts inside their wooden coffins. These writings, a continuation of the pyramid texts, offered spells for protection and guidance in the afterlife. By the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead became widespread, providing ordinary Egyptians who could afford it with a portable guide to survival beyond the grave. This democratization of the afterlife shows how deeply the obsession with death permeated all levels of society. The preparation for death shaped the economy, the arts, and even politics. Tomb construction was a vast industry. Entire communities, such as Deir el-Medina in western Thebes, were dedicated to building the tombs of pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. Artists, masons, and scribes spent their lives creating chambers filled with paintings, carvings, and texts designed to ensure a successful passage to the afterlife. The tombs were not only burial places, but eternal houses. Walls depicted scenes of daily life, plowing fields, banquets, hunting in the marshes, creating a microcosm of existence that the deceased could continue to enjoy forever. The Egyptian obsession with death also produced some of the most iconic artifacts in human history. Canopic jars, shabti figurines, gilded coffins, and elaborate masks, like that of Tutankhamun, were not created for display but for use in the next world. Each object had a function. Shabti figures, for example, were small servant statues buried with the dead, intended to perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the field of reeds. Canopic jars stored the internal organs removed during mummification, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Such details illustrate how carefully Egyptians thought about every aspect of existence after death. Religion gave structure to these practices. Osiris, once a fertility god, became the central figure of the afterlife myth. According to tradition, Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, and resurrected by his wife Isis. His triumph over death made him the ruler of the underworld, the model for every deceased Egyptian who sought rebirth. To be identified with Osiris in death was the ultimate goal. Funerary inscriptions often renamed the dead as Osiris' name, linking their fate directly to his. The cult of Osiris spread widely, reinforcing the belief that death could be overcome. Annual festivals reenacted his death and resurrection, assuring participants that they too would rise again. At Abydos, one of the most important cult centers, pilgrims left stelae inscribed with prayers, hoping to associate themselves with the god's eternal renewal. These religious practices turned death into a shared cultural project, binding the living and the dead in a continuous cycle. Yet for all their confidence in preparation, Egyptians also expressed anxiety about the dangers of the afterlife. The journey beyond the tomb was fraught with obstacles, hostile spirits, treacherous landscapes, and divine judges. This fear gave rise to spells, amulets, and elaborate funerary rituals meant to shield the soul. The very existence of the Hall of Ammit, where the heart was weighed, shows that Egyptians did not take salvation for granted. Eternal life was possible, but it had to be earned through righteous living and proper ritual. The depth of this obsession also reveals much about Egyptian society itself. In a land where life was often precarious, subject to droughts, floods, and disease, the promise of eternity offered stability and hope. Preparing for death was a way to impose order on uncertainty, to believe that existence had meaning beyond the grave. At the same time, it reinforced social hierarchies. Those who could afford elaborate tombs and texts had greater assurance of eternal security, though even the poorest were buried with tokens of remembrance. By the late period, after 700 BC, centuries of tradition had refined the culture of death into highly complex rituals. The Book of the Dead evolved into extensive manuals. Tomb paintings became increasingly detailed, and foreign influences, from the Assyrians to to the Persians and later the Greeks, blended with Egyptian practices, yet the core idea remained unchanged. Death was not an end, but a gateway. This obsession left a material legacy unmatched in human history. The pyramids, temples, and tombs that line the Nile Valley are monuments not to life, but to death and what was believed to come after. Without this fixation, Egypt might never have produced the art, architecture, and literature that continue to fascinate the world today. In the end, the Egyptian obsession with death was paradoxically an affirmation of life. By believing so strongly in an afterlife, Egyptians gave meaning to their existence, structure to their morality, and purpose to their civilization. Their vision of eternity transformed the way they built, worshipped, and remembered. And through the monuments they left behind, their obsession achieved exactly what they hoped for. A kind of immortality that endures thousands of years after their deaths. In the heart of ancient Egyptian civilization, no concept was more central than Mat. More than a goddess, Mat was the very principle of truth, justice, and balance that held the universe together. The Egyptians believed that the gods themselves lived by her order. Without Mat, the world would collapse into chaos, what they called Isfit, a state of disorder, violence, and darkness. Understanding Mat is key to understanding not just the Egyptian vision of the afterlife, but their politics, their laws, and the daily life of their people. The origins of Mat date back to the dawn of Egyptian history. As early as the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, inscriptions and reliefs depict the pharaoh presenting the image of Mat to the gods. This act symbolized that the ruler upheld order on earth, mirroring the cosmic order maintained by the divine. The king's primary duty was not conquest or expansion, but the preservation of Mat. In a world where the Nile could flood unpredictably, where famine and foreign invasions threatened survival, the assurance of balance was everything. Mat was personified as a woman wearing a single ostrich feather on her head. This feather became her most enduring symbol. Eventually, the very object against which the heart of the deceased would be weighed in the hall of judgment. The simplicity of the feather reflected the clarity of truth. It could not be hidden or distorted. The Egyptians believed that when one lived in harmony with Mat, life was smooth, families prospered, and society functioned as it should. But when Mat was ignored, when greed, dishonesty, or violence dominated, chaos threatened to unravel existence. In Egyptian texts, Mat appears constantly as both principle and deity. The instruction of Tehotep, a wisdom text written during the Old Kingdom around 2400 BCE, advises young officials to act in accordance with Mat, to be honest in judgment, humble in speech, and fair in dealings with others. These writings reveal how deeply the concept permeated every aspect of governance. Judges were often called priests of Mat, tasked with ensuring fairness in disputes. Legal verdicts were considered valid, not because they reflected human law, but because they aligned with the cosmic truth of Mat. Pharaohs invoked Mat as the foundation of their rule. In temples across Egypt, from Karnak to Luxor, scenes show rulers presenting a small figurine of Mat to gods like Ammon or Ra. This symbolic offering meant that the king was reaffirming his role as guarantor of order. When foreign invaders threatened, or when internal strife erupted, pharaohs often proclaimed themselves restorers of Mat. Even military campaigns were justified not as conquests, but as efforts to re-establish balance against the forces of chaos. The role of Mat extended beyond politics into religion and ritual. The daily temple liturgies included offerings in mat. Priests and scribes were expected to maintain purity and truth in their duties. In tomb inscriptions, the deceased often proclaimed, "I have done mat. I have not done is." This declaration linked personal morality directly to the cosmic balance. To lie, cheat, or oppress others was not just a personal failing, it was a disruption of the entire order of existence. The moral dimension of mat is most vividly seen in the negative confessions of the Book of the Dead. In spell 125, the deceased declares innocence of 42 specific offenses, each tied to one of the divine assessors of the judgment hall. The sins range from obvious murder, theft, lying to more subtle violations. I have not stopped the flow of water. I have not diminished the measure of grain. I have not stirred up strife. These confessions show how mat extended even into economic and environmental life. To cheat in trade, to hoard food during famine, or to pollute water was seen as a cosmic crime. Mat demanded honesty, justice, and sustainability. Philosophically, mat represented a unique worldview. Unlike Mesopotamia, where fate was often seen as capricious and the gods unpredictable, Egypt placed faith in a rational, balanced order. The sun rose and set predictably, the Nile's flood returned annually, and the stars followed their eternal paths. Egyptians saw these patterns as manifestations of mat. This gave their culture a sense of continuity and stability that lasted for millennia. The idea that truth and balance governed the universe created a deep optimism. Life had meaning, justice prevailed, and death was not an end but a transition overseen by order. Yet mat was never static. Maintaining balance required constant effort. This is why rituals, festivals, and offerings were so important. Each act of worship, each legal judgment, each honest trade was seen as reinforcing mat against the encroaching threat of chaos. The pharaoh's role was central, but every Egyptian bore responsibility. Farmers had to measure grain fairly, merchants had to use honest weights, and families had to treat each other with respect. The entire society was built on the shared belief that their actions contributed to the cosmic balance. In art and literature, mat is often depicted alongside Ra, the sun god. Every morning, Ra rose in the eastern sky, bringing light and order. And every evening he fought through the dangers of the underworld before rising again. This daily cycle symbolized mat in action. Without it, the world would fall into darkness. The union of Ra and mat was celebrated in hymns, emphasizing that truth and order were eternal, renewed each day through divine power. The endurance of the Egyptian civilization itself is a testament to the strength of mat as an idea. For over 3,000 years, through countless dynasties and foreign invasions, Egyptians returned again and again to mat as the foundation of their world. Even during the Amarna period in the 14th century BCE, when Pharaoh Akhenaten attempted to replace traditional religion with the worship of the Aten, he still described his reforms as expressions of mat. Later rulers, from Ramses II to Ptolemaic kings, continued to claim legitimacy by proclaiming themselves defenders of this eternal balance in the afterlife. Mat's role was ultimate. The weighing of the heart ritual made clear that truth and justice were not only ideals for society, but the final standard for the individual soul. To live outside of mat was to risk annihilation in death. To live within it was to achieve eternity. The feather of mat was thus both the simplest and the most profound symbol in Egyptian religion light. Pure and incorruptible, modern. Scholars often describe mat as both religion and philosophy, both law and morality. It is one of the most comprehensive ethical systems from the ancient world, binding cosmic order to personal conduct. In a sense, it was Egypt's answer to the question, what makes life meaningful? Their response was clear: harmony, justice, truth, and balance, the principles embodied in Mat. The legacy of Mat continues to resonate even today. Concepts of justice, truth, and accountability that shape modern societies find echoes in this ancient Egyptian principle. Though the gods and rituals have faded, the idea that the universe demands balance, that human actions have consequences, and that truth ultimately prevails, remains one of Egypt's most enduring gifts to humanity. For the ancient Egyptians, death was never a simple departure. It was a complex transition, a journey that demanded careful preparation of both body and spirit. Central to this preparation was the practice of mummification, a process that has fascinated and puzzled the modern world for centuries. Yet to the Egyptians, it was not a curiosity. It was an essential act of survival, the key to ensuring that the soul could endure beyond the grave. The logic behind mummification rested on a deep belief in the unity of the body and the spirit. Egyptians conceived the human being as a composition of different parts: the physical body Kut, the life force Ka, the personality or soul Ba, the shadow Shut, and the name Ren. In death, these elements separated, and unless the body was preserved and the proper rituals performed, the unity could not be restored. Without a preserved body, the Ka and Ba would be unable to return, leaving the deceased vulnerable to eternal destruction. The origins of mummification stretch back to Egypt's earliest history. In the pre-dynastic period, around 3500 BCE, bodies buried in shallow desert graves often dried naturally due to the arid sand. These naturally preserved remains likely inspired the idea that physical preservation was linked to eternal life. By the time of the Old Kingdom, deliberate efforts were being made to preserve the body more systematically. Over the centuries, the practice evolved into one of the most sophisticated mortuary processes in the ancient world. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, mummification had reached its peak in complexity and ritual significance. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, embalmers offered families 3 levels of service, depending on wealth. The most elaborate method involved removing the brain through the nostrils with a hooked instrument, carefully extracting the internal organs, and treating the body with expensive resins and oils. The body was then dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture from the deserts of Egypt, which desiccated the flesh and prevented decay. This drying process lasted about 40 days, after which the body was wrapped in layers of linen bandages, often hundreds of meters long. But mummification was not only a physical process, was a spiritual one. Each stage was accompanied by prayers, incantations, and rituals designed to protect the deceased. Priests, often wearing masks of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, performed ceremonies that invoked divine protection. One of the most significant rituals was the opening of the mouth, performed on the mummy or on statues of the deceased. This ceremony symbolically restored the senses sight, smell, taste, hearing, and speech so that the dead could once again interact with the world of the living and the gods in the afterlife. The internal organs removed during mummification were not discarded. They were preserved separately in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were each placed under the protection of deities such as Imseti, Hapi, Duamutev, and Kabesanuf. These jars were often elaborately carved and decorated, placed near the body in the tomb. The heart, however, was almost always left inside the body, for it was considered the seat of memory, morality, and identity, the organ that would later be weighed against the feather of Mat in the Hall of Judgment. Once the body was fully prepared, the focus shifted to the rituals of burial. Funerary processions were elaborate events, often lasting several days. Family members, priests, and mourners accompanied the mummy on its journey to the tomb, carrying offerings of food, drink, and amulet. Professional mourners, often women, wailed and sang laments, invoking the grief of Isis and Nephthys at the death of Osiris. These laments were not mere expressions of sorrow, but ritual performances meant to connect the deceased with the divine. Narrative of death and resurrection. The tomb itself was designed as an eternal house, whether a simple pit grave for a farmer or an elaborate rock-cut chamber for a noble. It was filled with goods to sustain the dead in the afterlife. Food offerings, furniture, clothing, weapons, and even board games like Xenot were included. Walls were decorated with scenes of agriculture, hunting, and banquets, creating a visual environment that the deceased could inhabit eternally. For kings and elites, these spaces were monumental: pyramids, mastabas, and eventually the grand tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Central to these preparations were the funerary texts that guided the soul through the perils of the afterlife. The pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, and the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom all served as manuals for the journey. Written in hieroglyphs and illustrated with vivid scenes, these texts provided spells to ward off dangers, instructions for addressing gods, and affirmations of innocence in the face of judgment. A typical Book of the Dead papyrus might include spell 125, the negative confession, where the deceased declared purity before the divine assessors of Mat. Amulets played a vital role in these preparations. Scarabs, ankhs, jed pillars, and eyes of Horus were placed among the wrappings of the mummy, each serving a protective function. The heart scarab, in particular, was inscribed with spells urging the heart not to betray the deceased during judgment. Jewelry, often inscribed with sacred texts, reinforced the magical protection. Every item had a purpose: to shield the deceased from harm, to grant them strength, or to ensure their rebirth. The expense of these preparations varied greatly. While pharaohs and high officials could commission entire teams of artisans and priests, common people made simpler arrangements. Yet even the poorest Egyptians sought to prepare for death in whatever way they could. Clay models of servants, rough wooden amulets, and small offering tables testify to a widespread belief that no one could afford to neglect the afterlife. Death was the great equalizer. Everyone had to face judgment, and everyone required some preparation. Mummification also carried political and religious significance. By preserving the bodies of kings, Egyptians reinforced the divine continuity of kingship. The pharaoh, even in death, was expected to join the gods and ensure the stability of the cosmos. Elaborate state funerals projected power, reminding subjects and rivals alike that the ruler's authority extended beyond life itself. The care lavished on royal mummies, such as those of Seti I, Ramses II, and Tutankhamun, demonstrated that Egypt's rulers intended to be eternal, both in heaven and in the memory of their people. Over time, the techniques of mummification evolved, sometimes declining in quality during periods of political instability. In the third intermediate period, after 1100 BCE, embalmers began to stuff bodies with sawdust and resin to maintain shape, rather than carefully removing organs. Yet the rituals continued, a testament to the unbroken importance of preparation for the soul, even under Greek and Roman rule. When Egyptian culture was profoundly transformed, mummification endured. The famous Fayum portraits painted likenesses placed on mummies during the Roman period show the blending of Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions. But the underlying belief in preserving the body for eternity remained intact. The archaeological rediscovery of mummies in the modern era has given us extraordinary insight into these practices. Excavations in the Valley of the Kings, in Saqqara, and in countless smaller cemeteries have revealed the meticulous care taken to prepare the dead. CT scans of royal mummies show the precision of embalming techniques, the use of resins from as far away as the Levant, and the presence of amulets hidden within wrappings. These discoveries confirm what ancient texts described: a civilization deeply invested in preserving not only memory but existence itself. In the end, mummification and funerary rituals were not simply about preserving a corpse. They were about affirming a worldview that death was a threshold, not an end. By preparing the body, equipping the tomb, and invoking the gods through ritual, Egyptians believed they could control their destiny in the afterlife. The process united the living and the dead, the human and the divine, the individual and the cosmos. Each preserved body was a statement of faith that life could be conquered, that eternity was within reach, and that through preparation the soul could endure forever. Asterisk. For the ancient Egyptians, death was a journey through a perilous and unfamiliar landscape. To navigate this terrain, they relied on a guidebook unlike any other, the collection of texts known today as the Book of the Dead. Though the name was coined by 19th century scholars, the Egyptians themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was not a single fixed work, but a collection of spells, prayers, and illustrations meant to equip the deceased for their passage through the underworld. The origins of the Book of the Dead can be traced back to earlier funerary literature. In the Old Kingdom, around 2400 BCE, the pyramid texts were inscribed directly on the walls of royal tombs. These spells invoked the gods, protected the king from harm, and helped him ascend to the heavens to join the sun god Ra by the Middle Kingdom. Around 2000 BCE, the coffin texts extended these protections to nobles and officials. Written on the inside of coffins, they reflected the growing democratization of the afterlife. By the New Kingdom, after 1550 BCE, the tradition evolved into the Book of the Dead portable papyri that could be purchased, customized, and placed in tombs alongside the deceased. Each copy of the Book of the Dead was unique. Families commissioned scribes and artists to prepare scrolls for their loved ones, selecting spells most relevant to their needs. Some papyri stretched over 20 meters, covered in vivid hieroglyphs and colorful illustrations. Others were shorter and more modest. The most famous examples, such as the Papyrus of Ani or the Papyrus of Hanufa, survive today with extraordinary clarity, providing a detailed window into Egyptian beliefs. The texts contained more than 190 spells, though no single copy included them all. These spells served practical and spiritual functions. Some were protective charms, incantations to ward off snakes, crocodiles, or hostile spirits that threatened the soul. Others provided knowledge, the correct names of gates, deities, or rivers in the underworld, ensuring safe passage. Many were affirmations of innocence, declarations that the deceased had lived in accordance with Mat. One of the most important sections was spell 125, the so-called negative confession. In it, the deceased stood before the 42 assessors of Mat and proclaimed innocence of specific sins. I have not stolen, I have not murdered, I have not lied, I have not diminished the measure of grain, I have not polluted the water. These statements reveal not only religious concerns, but the ethical values of Egyptian society. Truth, fairness, justice, and respect for nature were central to their worldview. To recite these words in life and in death was to align oneself with cosmic order. The Book of the Dead also prepared the deceased for the climactic trial in the Hall of Mat. Detailed illustrations show the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth, with Anubis adjusting the scales and Thoth recording. The outcome, amulets and spells, urged the heart not to betray its owner. The texts promised that, if justified, the soul would pass on to the field of reeds, a paradise where existence mirrored the best of earthly life. These texts were not abstract theology. They were practical tools, treated as essential equipment for the journey after death. Archaeological excavations reveal that even modest tombs often contained fragments of funerary papyri. The wealthy could afford elaborate scrolls, richly decorated with illustrations of gods, demons, and landscapes of the underworld. The less fortunate might copy single spells onto scraps of linen or pottery. Yet the belief was the same: without these guides, the soul risked losing its way in the perilous afterlife. The Book of the Dead also reflected the global connections of Egypt. Materials for ink and papyrus were sourced from across the Nile Valley, while resins and pigments sometimes came from as far as the Levant. The production of funerary papyri was a specialized industry, employing scribes, artists, and priests. This was not merely a craft, but a sacred duty, creating texts that bridged the human and the divine. For modern historians, the Book of the Dead is one of the richest sources for understanding Egyptian religion and ethics. Its spells reveal not only a fear of death, but a profound trust in order and justice. The Egyptians believed the afterlife could be navigated with preparation, knowledge, and righteousness. In this sense, the Book of the Dead was more than a funerary text, was a moral and spiritual handbook, guiding both the living and the dead. The endurance of the Book of the Dead over centuries testifies to its power. Even during the late period and into Greco-Roman times, new versions were produced, sometimes merging with Greek magical traditions. Though the names of gods and the forms of rituals changed, the core idea remained: knowledge, truth, and preparation could secure eternal life. Today, fragments of these papyri rest in museums across the world. The vivid colors of their illustrations, gods painted in gold and turquoise, souls sailing on boats across celestial rivers, still carry the same message as they did millennia ago. Death is a journey, but with guidance, it can be overcome. Among all the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, few were as intimately connected to death as Anubis. Depicted with the sleek black head of a jackal, he was the protector of graves, the patron of embalmers, and the silent guide of souls. His presence loomed over every stage of the funerary process, from the preparation of the body to the judgment in the Hall of Mat. The origins of Anubis stretch deep into Egypt's early history. In the Old Kingdom, before Osiris rose to prominence as lord of the underworld, Anubis himself was considered the chief god of the dead. Pyramid texts from the 24th century BCE refer to him as he who is upon his mountain, the guardian of necropolises, watching over cemeteries from the desert cliffs. His association with jackals came from the animals that prowled burial grounds at night. By adopting the image of the jackal, Egyptians transformed a threat into a protector. As the cult of Osiris grew, Anubis's role shifted but remained vital. Osiris became the ruler of the underworld, while Anubis assumed the role of guide and protector. He prepared the body, ensured proper burial, and led the deceased into the presence of Osiris. In mythology, it was Anubis who embalmed the body of Osiris after his murder by Set, wrapping him carefully and performing the first mummification. This act gave divine sanction to the practice and established Anubis as the patron of Embalmers. In temples and tombs, Anubis was depicted overseeing mummification rituals. Priests performing embalming often wore wooden masks of the jackal-headed god, invoking his presence as they worked. His black coloration was not meant to reflect the natural fur of a jackal, but symbolized the fertile soil of the Nile and the concept of regeneration. To Egyptians, black was the color of rebirth, not decay. Texts and artwork show Anubis performing critical roles in the afterlife. He adjusts the scales during the weighing of the heart, ensuring that the judgment is fair. He leads the deceased by the hand into the hall of Ammit, presenting them to Osiris. He watches over the tomb to prevent desecration. Unlike many gods associated with power or chaos, Anubis was quiet, impartial, and steadfast, a guardian who did not deceive or abandon. Anubis also embodied the deep Egyptian concern with proper burial. To die without a tomb, without embalming, without ritual, was considered a terrible fate. Such souls were believed to wander restlessly, never finding peace. Anubis's protection extended even to the poorest burials. Amulets shaped like jackals, prayers invoking his name, and offerings left at cemeteries all called upon him to guard the dead. The cult of Anubis was not limited to kings and elites. Common Egyptians prayed to him for protection of their loved ones' remains. His temples, though less grand than those of Ra or Ammon, were widespread. Cemeteries often included chapels dedicated to him, where families could leave offerings. His priests oversaw embalming workshops, forming a crucial part of the funerary economy. Over time, Anubis's role also blended with that of Hermes in Greek tradition. In the Greco-Roman period, the composite deity Anubis emerged, combining features of both gods as guides of souls. Yet, the core identity of Anubis remained unchanged, the jackal-headed guardian of the dead. For modern researchers, Anubis provides insight into the Egyptian approach to death. He represents not fear, but protection, not chaos, but order. His quiet presence reflects the Egyptian conviction that death was manageable with preparation, ritual, and divine assistance. The god who once embodied the threat of jackals became the greatest ally of the deceased. Today, the image of Anubis endures as one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. Statues, reliefs, and papyri show him leaning over mummies, adjusting scales, or standing sentinel at tomb entrances. His sleek black form embodies the timeless Egyptian hope that even in death, one would not be alone, but guided by a faithful protector into eternity. In the worldview of ancient Egypt, death did not bring an immediate end to existence. Instead, it ushered the deceased into a place where justice, truth, and divine order determined eternal destiny. This place was not a vague, shadowy underworld, but a carefully imagined courtroom, known from texts and tomb art as the Hall of Mat, the divine courtroom. It was here that every soul, whether king or commoner, stood before the gods to account for the life they had lived. The idea of a divine judgment was not unique to Egypt, but nowhere else in the ancient world was it imagined with such detail. In Egyptian belief, the soul did not pass blindly into another realm, but faced a trial overseen by an assembly of deities. The Book of the Dead provides vivid descriptions of this scene, which became central to funerary art during the New Kingdom. From about 1550 BCE onward, at the heart of the courtroom sat Osiris, the lord of the underworld, enthroned as judge. His green skin symbolized rebirth, while his white linen wrappings evoked the image of a mummified king, crowned with the tall, white Atef crown flanked by ostrich feathers, and holding the crook and flail, the symbols of kingship. Osiris represented authority, continuity, and the hope of resurrection. On either side stood his sisters, Isis and Nephthys, the goddesses who had mourned and revived him in myth, silently lending their presence as guardians of justice. Before Osiris stretched a hall lined with gods, known as the 42 Assessors. Each of these divine figures presided over a particular moral or social principle. In funerary texts, the deceased addressed each one by name, denying specific sins, theft, murder, lying, desecration of temples, or harming others. These declarations formed the negative confession, one of the most striking moral documents from the ancient world. To Egyptians, this was not a hypothetical test. It was the lived standard of morality. By proclaiming innocence before each god, the deceased demonstrated a life lived in harmony with Mat. Overseeing the trial was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. Holding a reed pen and palette, he acted as divine scribe, recording the outcome of the judgment. Thoth's role ensured that the process was impartial, exact, and eternal. What was written by Thoth became divine record, unalterable for all time. His presence reflected the Egyptian reverence for writing as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Anubis, the jackal-headed protector of the dead, played an equally crucial role. Standing at the scales, he carefully placed the heart of the deceased in one pan and the feather of Mat in the other. His calm, steady presence symbolized fairness. Anubis was not swayed by emotion or bribery. He embodied the principle that truth alone decided the outcome. The feather of Mat represented ultimate truth and justice. Its lightness symbolized purity. Its balance ensured fairness. To Egyptians, this image captured the essence of their belief. The soul was accountable to universal principles, not to arbitrary whims of the gods. The heart, considered the seat of thought, memory, and morality, was weighed against this standard. If the heart was lighter or equal, the deceased was declared Makeru, true of voice or justified. If it was heavier, the soul was condemned. Waiting nearby was Ammit, the terrifying devourer, with the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the back of a hippopotamus. She embodied Egypt's most feared predators. If the judgment failed, Ammit consumed the heart, annihilating the soul forever. This fate was more dreadful than torment. It was non-existence, the erasure of identity, memory, and future. Egyptians feared this second death above all. The scene of the divine courtroom became one of the most frequently depicted moments in Egyptian art. The papyrus of Ani, dating to the 13th century BCE, shows Ani led by Anubis into the hall, his heart being weighed, while Ammit crouches nearby. Behind Ani stands his wife, Tutu, raising her hands in prayer. In another panel, Horus presents Ani to Osiris, who sits enthroned beneath a canopy of lotus flowers. These images were not mere decoration, they were functional tools, reminders, and guides for the soul on its perilous journey. The ritual power of the courtroom scene lay in its universality. Pharaohs and nobles might prepare with grand tombs and elaborate papyri, but even the humblest Egyptians imagined themselves standing before Osiris, facing the same judgment. In life, wealth and power created deep inequalities, but in death, all were measured by the same feather. This belief reinforced the centrality of Mat in Egyptian culture. Truth, justice, and balance applied equally to all. The courtroom also reflected Egyptian ideas of accountability. The negative confession reveals not only spiritual concerns, but social values. Many of the denials dealt with fairness in trade, honesty in speech, kindness to others, and respect for resources. To say, "I have not diminished the measure of grain" was both a spiritual claim and an economic principle. To say, "I have not polluted the water" recognized the Nile as sacred and essential to life. These declarations show how Egyptians integrated morality, religion, and environment into a unified system. The symbolism of the courtroom reached beyond religion. It shaped law and governance in Egypt. Judges were sometimes called priests of Mat, and legal cases were understood as earthly reflections of the cosmic trial. Just as Osiris presided over the dead, so too did officials preside over the living. The belief that all people would eventually face judgment reinforced the moral order of society. For archaeologists and historians, the courtroom scene offers one of the clearest windows into Egyptian psychology. It shows a people deeply invested in the idea that life had meaning and that actions carried eternal consequences. Unlike some ancient cultures that saw the afterlife as a shadowy continuation or a grim underworld, Egypt imagined a just and balanced system. Goodness was rewarded, evil was punished, and truth prevailed. The endurance of this imagery over centuries testifies to its power. From the Old Kingdom pyramid texts to the Greco-Roman period, the core elements remained: Osiris enthroned, Thoth recording, Anubis guiding, the scales balancing, and Ammit waiting. The divine courtroom was timeless, eternal, and unchanging, just like the principles it embodied. For modern audiences, the image still resonates. The idea of a heart weighed against truth, of accountability before a higher order, remains a powerful metaphor. It reflects a universal human concern that our lives matter, that justice is real, and that in the end, truth will be revealed. The Egyptians believed that this courtroom was not a myth, but a certainty. Every funeral ritual, every tomb inscription, every spell of the Book of the Dead was a preparation for this moment. To live without Mat was to risk annihilation. To live in harmony with it was to achieve eternal life. The divine courtroom thus stood at the center of Egyptian religion, culture, and morality. It was not only the place of judgment, but the ultimate assurance that existence had meaning and that the cosmos was governed by order, not chaos. For the ancient Egyptians, this vision gave life its purpose and death its hope. In the vast spiritual architecture of ancient Egypt, no image was more central, more dramatic, or more enduring than the weighing of the heart. Known from papyri, tomb walls, and funerary inscriptions, this moment defined the fate of every Egyptian. After death, it was not an abstract metaphor, but a vivid courtroom scene, described and illustrated again and again, a balanced scale holding the heart of the deceased on one side and the feather of Mat on the other. 2 Egyptians. The heart. Ib was not merely an organ pumping blood. It was the center of thought, memory, conscience, and morality. They believed it recorded every deed, good or bad, throughout a person's life. Unlike the brain, which they considered insignificant and often removed during mummification, the heart was left in place. It would testify truthfully in the judgment hall. The concept was simple but profound. Your own life was the evidence against you. The feather of Mat, by contrast, represented truth, order, and balance. As the goddess of cosmic harmony, Mat was not only a principle of morality, but the very foundation of existence. Without her, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, and society would collapse. To weigh the heart against her feather was to measure a soul against the eternal order of the universe itself. The scene of the weighing was first hinted at in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, but became fully developed in the New Kingdom, especially in the Book of the Dead. Spell 30b, often inscribed on heart scarab amulets, pleaded, "O my heart, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me before the keeper of the balance." These words reflect the anxiety that the heart might betray its owner, revealing hidden sins. Egyptians recognized the weight of conscience and the impossibility of hiding truth in death. In the whole, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, was responsible for adjusting the scales. His impartial hand ensured fairness, symbolizing that divine justice was not arbitrary. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded the results on a papyrus scroll, making the verdict eternal. If the scales balanced or the heart was lighter than the feather, the deceased was declared true of voice and permitted to enter the field of reeds. If not, Ammit, the devourer, waited to annihilate the soul. Artistic depictions of this moment are striking in their detail. In the papyrus of Ani, dating to around 1250 BCE, the deceased Ani watches anxiously as Anubis weighs his heart. Ammit crouches nearby, ready to devour. Thoth stands with reed pen in hand, while Horus leads Ani forward to Osiris once the balance is favorable. Such scenes were painted not only for elites, but for common Egyptians who could afford funerary papyri. The weighing was a universal trial, faced by all. The moral implications of the scales were immense. Unlike societies where fate after death was determined by social rank or divine whim, Egypt envisioned a system where personal conduct mattered most. A pharaoh and a farmer stood before the same balance. Wealth could provide elaborate tombs and texts, but it could not alter the weight of the heart. This belief gave Egyptian society a strong ethical foundation. Honesty, fairness, and respect for others were not just civic virtues, but cosmic necessities. The negative confession, recited before the 42 assessors, reinforced this morality. Statements like, "I have not stolen, I have not slain unjustly, and I have not withheld milk from the mouths of children," show how deeply ethics permeated daily life. The scales did not weigh wealth or power, but truth. A dishonest merchant, a corrupt official, or a cruel master would face the same consequences as any criminal. The scales also reflected Egypt's broader understanding of balance in nature. The Nile's cycles of flood and fertility, the predictable rising of the sun, the order of the stars, all expressed Mat. Human morality was part of this same system. To lie, cheat, or exploit others was not just wrong, but a disruption of the cosmic balance. The scales symbolized the integration of human life with the universe. The fear of failing this test was profound. Heart scarabs, amulets, placed over the chest of mummies, were often inscribed with spells begging the heart to remain silent. These objects show the anxiety Egyptians felt about the judgment, yet they also reveal confidence in preparation. With the right rituals, spells, and a righteous life, the scales could be faced with hope. The symbolism of the scales endured through centuries. Even during the Greco-Roman period, Egyptian tombs continued to depict this moment, blending it with Hellenistic ideas of judgment. The image of the balance of justice eventually influenced later religious traditions, echoing in concepts of divine judgment found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For the Egyptians, however, the meaning was immediate and personal. The scales reminded them that life carried weight, that actions mattered, and that truth could not be avoided. To live in harmony with Mat was to lighten the heart, ensuring safe passage into eternity. To live against her was to risk annihilation. The scales of justice were thus more than a ritual scene. They were the ultimate expression of Egypt's philosophy. The universe is ordered, truth prevails, and every soul is accountable. If the scales of Mat represented hope, fairness, and eternal life, then Ammit embodied fear, annihilation, and the final end. Known as the devourer of the dead, she waited in the hall of judgment, a monstrous figure whose sole purpose was to consume the hearts of the unworthy. Ammit's form was terrifying, the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. To Egyptians, these were the three most dangerous animals of the Nile region, combined into a single embodiment of destruction. She was not worshipped, did not have temples or priests, and received no offerings. Unlike other deities, she had no cult. She was feared, not adored. Her role was purely punitive, to erase the wicked from existence. Texts describe Ammit as waiting silently by the scales. If the heart of the deceased was heavy burdened with lies, cruelty, or injustice, Anubis fed it to her. The devouring was not a symbolic act, but a cosmic reality. Once consumed, the soul ceased to exist, experiencing what Egyptians called the second death. Unlike eternal torment in other traditions, this was absolute annihilation, no memory, no name, no afterlife. For Egyptians, this fate was the worst imaginable. The presence of Ammit reveals much about Egyptian thought. Their afterlife was not a place of universal reward, nor a landscape of eternal torture. Instead, it was conditional. Those who lived in harmony with Mat joined Osiris in the field of reeds, a paradise of abundance and peace. Those who did not were simply destroyed. Ammit ensured that evil had no place in eternity. Artistic depictions show her crouched beside the scales, jaws wide, waiting. In the papyrus of Hunefer, she looms beneath the balance as Thoth records the judgment. In others, she sits passively, ready but restrained, a reminder that destruction was always possible. Her presence injected tension into the courtroom scene, emphasizing that the trial had real consequences. Ammit was not considered evil. She did not hunt souls or cause suffering. She was the instrument of justice, a natural force within the cosmic order. Egyptians feared her not as a malevolent demon, but as the inevitable consequence of living outside Mat. Her existence underscored the seriousness of moral life. Every lie, every injustice, every selfish act threatened to weigh down the heart. This fear shaped Egyptian ethics. The negative confessions, repeated denials, I have not robbed, I have not killed unjustly, I have not polluted the Nile, all carried the shadow of Ammit. To speak these words was to assert purity, to distance oneself from the devourer's jaws. Ammit's looming presence encouraged Egyptians to live truthfully, fairly, and in balance. The idea of annihilation also reveals Egypt's distinctive approach to the afterlife. Many cultures imagined eternal punishment for the wicked. Egypt envisioned something different, a just system where righteousness was rewarded and wickedness erased. This outlook reflected their broader worldview. The cosmos was orderly, life was cyclical, and balance was paramount. Evil had no enduring place. Ammit's symbolism extended into later periods. In Greco-Roman Egypt, her image appeared in hybrid forms, sometimes interpreted by Greeks as a demon of destruction. Yet her role remained consistent, the enforcer of justice. She did not tempt, deceive, or torment. She waited silently, a warning that the afterlife was not guaranteed. For modern observers, Ammit is both terrifying and fascinating. Her monstrous form embodies primal fears, while her role embodies ultimate justice. She reminds us that for the Egyptians, eternity was not a right but a responsibility. To achieve it required truth, balance, and harmony with Maat. Failure meant obliteration. In this way, Ammit was essential to the Egyptian vision of morality. She gave weight to the judgment, seriousness to the trial, and urgency to life. Her silent crouch by the scales remains one of the most haunting images of the ancient world. In the grand hall of judgment, the scales were merciless. When a heart, heavy with sin or imbalance, tipped against a feather of Maat, there was no appeal, no second trial, no mercy. To the Egyptians, this moment was not symbolic, it was absolute. When the heart failed, the consequences were final. The fate of the condemned soul was annihilation. Unlike later religious traditions that imagined hells of fire and eternal torment, the Egyptians envisioned something more terrifying: non-existence. The devourer Ammit consumed the heart, and with it, the person's identity, memory, and destiny. Egyptians called this the second death. The body had died once. Now the soul itself perished forever. This outcome reflected a unique vision of justice. The Egyptians did not believe in a realm where the wicked were tortured eternally. To them, that would give evil too much permanence. Instead, evil was erased, cast out of the cosmic order. Only truth, harmony, and righteousness were eternal. A soul unworthy of Maat simply ceased to be. The terror of this fate is revealed in funerary texts. In spell 30b of the Book of the Dead, the deceased begs, "O my heart, do not stand up against me as a witness, do not oppose me before the keeper of the balance, do not cause my name to stink before the gods." The desperation is clear, too. Be found wanting was to be erased not only from the afterlife, but from the memory of the living. In Egyptian thought, to lose one's name was to die utterly. The fear of the second death shaped Egyptian rituals and daily life. Families took extraordinary care to preserve tombs, protect names with inscriptions, and place amulets over the heart. Heart scarabs often carried the plea that the heart remains silent in judgment. Even the poorest Egyptians sought some form of protection, whether a crude amulet, a simple offering, or a prayer. Archaeology has uncovered the remains of those preparations. In burials across the Nile Valley, scarabs inscribed with spell 30b appear again and again. Some are finely carved from green jasper, others roughly made from clay. Yet their purpose was identical: to shield the heart from betrayal. The ubiquity of these objects shows the depth of fear Egyptians felt about judgment. The consequences of failure also reveal much about Egyptian morality. The threat of annihilation gave weight to Matt's principles. To cheat, lie, or exploit others was not only socially damaging, it endangered the soul itself. The negative confession, with its long list of denials, reflects this seriousness. When Egyptians declared, "I have not stolen, I have not killed unjustly, I have not caused suffering," they were not making casual statements. They were affirming survival. Historical records suggest that this belief influenced law and governance. Judges were expected to uphold Maat because injustice could disrupt not only society but eternity. The pharaoh, as protector of Maat, bore responsibility for ensuring fairness and balance in the land. To fail in this duty risked disorder, famine, and cosmic chaos. The weight of the heart was thus mirrored in the weight of governance. The imagery of failure was powerful. Ammit, crouching beside the scales, symbolized the constant possibility of destruction. Tumat shows her with gaping jaws, teeth ready to snap shut on the heart of the unworthy. The sight of her was a warning. Eternity was not guaranteed. Egyptians knew that their lives mattered, that every action left a mark, and that failure would lead to the jaws of the devourer. Yet the idea of annihilation also carried a certain fairness. Eternal torment for finite sins would have seemed unjust. Instead, the Egyptians envisioned a system where evil simply vanished. This belief reflected their worldview. Balance must be maintained, truth must prevail, and disorder must be erased. By eliminating the unworthy, the cosmos was purified. The fear of failing the scales was balanced by hope. Egyptians prepared extensively through rituals, amulets, and righteous living to avoid this fate. The possibility of annihilation gave urgency to morality and meaning to existence. In this way, the threat of Ammit was not only terrifying, but constructive. It encouraged truth, justice, and harmony in life. For modern audiences, the concept of the second death remains striking. It reflects a profound human concern, the fear not of punishment, but of oblivion. To the Egyptians, this was the ultimate horror, to be forgotten, erased, and denied eternity. When the heart failed, that horror became reality. If the fear of failure defined one side of Egyptian belief, the promise of success defined the other. When the heart balanced against the feather of Matwin, it was light, pure, and justified. The soul achieved its greatest reward, eternal life in the field of reeds. To be declared Makeru, true of voice or justified, was the ultimate victory. The phrase appears again and again in tomb inscriptions, often written after the name of the deceased, the Osiris name, true of voice. This designation signaled that the individual had passed the trial and secured a place in eternity. The field of reeds, or Aru, was imagined as a perfected version of Egypt itself. Just as the Nile's fertile floodplains sustained life, so too did the field of reeds sustain the blessed. Texts and tomb paintings describe endless fields of grain, rivers of clear water, and abundant orchards. The justified dead plowed fields, harvested crops, and feasted with their loved ones in an eternal cycle of prosperity. Life continued, but without hunger, disease, or conflict. This vision reflected the Egyptian ideal of balance. Eternity was not radically different from life, but an enhanced version of it. The rhythms of farming, family, and community continued, free from the uncertainties of drought or death, for a society so deeply tied to the land and the Niles. Cycles. This paradise was both familiar and perfect. The Book of the Dead provides vivid descriptions of this reward. Spell 110 describes the justified soul entering the field of reeds, greeted by gods, free to walk, eat, drink, and live forever. The text promises, there is wheat there, and barley, and fields stretching endlessly. The flood comes there, and the harvest never fails. The imagery is one of abundance and security, a dream fulfilled for a people whose survival often depended on the fickle rise of the Nile. Archaeological evidence shows how central this vision was. Tomb walls from Thebes, dating to the New Kingdom, depict scenes of the deceased ploughing fields, sailing boats, and enjoying banquets in the afterlife. These were not symbolic images, but literal expectations. Egyptians believed that through ritual, magic, and justification they could secure eternal life in this paradise. Shabti figurines, often buried with the dead, reveal more about these beliefs. These small statues, inscribed with spells, were meant to come alive in the afterlife and perform labor for their owner. If the gods called upon the deceased to work in the field of reeds, the Shabti would answer in their place. Wealthier Egyptians might be buried with hundreds of these figurines, creating a miniature workforce for eternity. The joy of passing the scales was also reflected in rituals of remembrance. Families visited tombs, offered food and drink, and recited prayers for their ancestors. These acts sustained the deceased in the afterlife, reinforcing the connection between living and dead. In turn, the justified dead were believed to intercede with the gods on behalf of the living. This reciprocal relationship gave meaning to family ties across generations. The reward of eternity also had political significance. Pharaohs presented themselves not only as rulers in life, but as eternal kings in death. Monumental tombs, such as those in the Valley of the Kings, were decorated with elaborate scenes of the afterlife, affirming the king's place among the gods. By presenting themselves as justified souls, pharaohs reinforced their divine authority and the promise of eternal stability for the nation. Yet the vision of the field of reeds was not limited to elites. Even modest burials often included depictions of agricultural abundance, miniature tools, or simple offerings. These show that ordinary Egyptians, too, hoped for the same reward. The universality of the scales meant that anyone, regardless of status, could achieve eternity if their heart was pure. The concept of passing the scales also influenced Egyptian ethics. To live in harmony with Maat was to prepare for this moment. Truthfulness, fairness, and kindness were not only civic virtues, but the keys to eternal life. Tomb inscriptions often emphasized generosity. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothes to the naked. These statements were not boasts, but testimonies, evidence for the trial. The vision of eternity was powerful because it was achievable. Unlike myths that reserved paradise for gods or kings, Egypt offered it to all who lived truthfully. The feather of Maat was the standard, and anyone who met it could pass. This inclusiveness gave hope, shaped morality, and unified society around a shared destiny. For modern audiences, the Egyptian vision of paradise may seem modest compared to later ideas of heaven, yet its power lies in its familiarity. The field of reeds was not a fantastical realm, but a perfected Egypt, fertile, secure, abundant, and eternal. It reflected the values of a people who cherished order, balance, and continuity above all. When the heart passed the scales, the Egyptian soul entered this paradise, free from fear, sustained forever. The courtroom of judgment, the scales of Maat, and the threat of Ammit all led to this moment of triumph. To be justified was to achieve what every Egyptian longed for: eternal life in the perfect reflection of their homeland. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife was not a distant dream, was an ever-present reality shaping how people lived their daily lives. The moral code that determined whether a soul would pass the judgment of the scales or be devoured by Ammit was not reserved for lofty sermons or elite philosophy. It was woven into the everyday choices of farmers, merchants, scribes, and rulers. At the center of this code stood Mat, the principle of truth, balance, and justice, and the belief that one's actions in life carried eternal consequences. The negative confession, preserved in spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, is the clearest statement of Egyptian ethics. In it, the deceased proclaims innocence before 42 divine judges, each representing a specific principle. The list includes both universal prohibitions and deeply practical ones. I have not killed unjustly. I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not diminished the measure of grain. I have not withheld milk from the mouths of children. I have not polluted the water. Each declaration connected morality not only to divine law, but also to the rhythms of society and nature. This text reveals how Egyptians integrated spiritual and ethical life. Justice was not confined to temples or courts. It governed trade, farming, family, and even environmental stewardship. To cheat in business, to withhold food in famine, to foul the Nile with waste, all were considered violations of Mat. The Nile was lifeblood, the harvest was survival, and truth was harmony. Ethical living was thus not abstract but intensely practical. Archaeological evidence supports this vision of morality. In tomb inscriptions, officials often highlighted their ethical behavior alongside their achievements. One Middle Kingdom nomarch, or provincial governor, carved into his tomb at Beni Hazen, "I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothes to the naked. I was a husband to the widow, a shelter to the orphan." Such statements were not boasts of generosity for vanity's sake. They were recorded testimonies meant to serve in the afterlife judgment. Tombs became moral records, showcasing how the deceased had lived according to Mat. Pharaohs too presented themselves as defenders of Mat. Royal inscriptions frequently describe kings as upholding justice, protecting the weak, and maintaining cosmic balance. In the reign of Horemheb, around 1320 BCE, legal reforms were introduced to curb corruption, especially among tax officials and local administrators. The king declared that his laws were expressions of Mat, designed to restore balance to society. Even the most powerful ruler was expected to live under the same principles that governed a farmer or merchant. The daily courts of Egypt echoed this cosmic order. Judges were often referred to as priests of Mat, and court proceedings invoked her name. Disputes over land, inheritance, or trade were settled by appealing to truth and fairness, not arbitrary power. Papyrus documents from Dai el-Madinah, the workers' village that built the royal tombs, record trials where neighbors accused one another of theft, slander, or neglect of duties. Witnesses gave testimony, scribes recorded proceedings, and verdicts were delivered in the name of Mat. The idea that truth must prevail was embedded in the very machinery of law. Even economic transactions bore the imprint of this ethic. Honest weights and measures were sacred. To cheat a customer by adjusting a scale or diluting beer was not only fraud but sacrilege. The god Thoth, associated with writing and record keeping, was also invoked in commerce, reminding participants that dishonesty could tip the heart against them in judgment. This concern for fairness ensured trust in markets and stability in society. Ethical life extended into the household. Family bonds were considered sacred, and care for the vulnerable was a moral duty. Wisdom texts, such as the instruction of Tehotep from the Old Kingdom, advised sons to honor their mothers, be kind to their wives, and raise their children with fairness. Respect for elders was emphasized, as was compassion for the poor. The home was not exempt from Matit, was its foundation. Religious practice reinforced these values. Daily offerings in temples were described as acts of Mat, sustaining the gods and maintaining cosmic balance. Priests performed rituals, not for personal gain, but to uphold order for all. Festivals, processions, and communal rituals brought people together under the shared belief that their collective actions preserved harmony between gods, nature, and humanity. Ethics also shaped attitudes toward the environment. The Nile was revered not just as a river, but as a divine force. Hymns to the Nile celebrated its annual flood, which brought fertility to the land. To block water, divert canals selfishly, or poison streams was considered an offense against Mat. Agricultural practice was framed as cooperation with cosmic order, not exploitation. Farmers prayed for good floods, offered sacrifices for abundant harvests, and measured their grain honestly. The universality of these principles made them powerful. A peasant harvesting barley, a scribe copying accounts, a merchant selling linenol were participating in the same moral order as the gods themselves. Mat unified society by linking the smallest daily actions with the grandest cosmic truths. This gave Egyptians a strong sense of purpose. Their lives, however humble, mattered in the eternal balance. Yet Egyptians were not naive about human weakness. The abundance of amulets, heart scarabs, and protective spells shows the anxiety people felt about failing the scales. Even the most righteous person sought spiritual insurance. The rituals of confession, purification, and offering were designed to cleanse impurities and reinforce commitment to truth. Egyptians knew that living ethically was a lifelong challenge, but they believed that preparation, honesty, and devotion could secure salvation. The democratization of the afterlife during the Middle and New Kingdoms strengthened this ethic. In earlier periods, the king was seen as the primary guarantor of Mat, ascending to the heavens while commoners remained in shadowy existence. But as coffin texts and the Book of the Dead became widespread, ordinary Egyptians gained access to the same afterlife promises. This universality meant that morality mattered for everyone. A farmer could enter the field of reeds just as surely as a pharaoh, provided his heart was pure. This vision shaped Egyptian culture for millennia. The stability of their civilization, the continuity of government, religion, and social order across 3,000 years owes much to this shared commitment to Mat. By linking cosmic justice to personal ethics, Egyptians created a society where daily life was infused with purpose, and morality was inseparable from survival. For modern audiences, the Egyptian integration of ethics and afterlife belief offers striking insights. Their morality was practical, communal, and deeply tied to the environment. Truth was not an abstract ideal, but a lived reality, measured in fair trade, honest speech, and care for others. To live ethically was not only to secure peace on earth, but to ensure eternity in the field of reeds. Thus, the weighing of the heart was not only a ritual for the dead, but a guide for the living. It reminded every Egyptian, in every act, that their heart was being weighed not only in the future, but in the present, through the choices that sustained Maat. In life, Egypt was a land of vast inequality. Pharaohs reigned as divine monarchs, wielding immense wealth and authority, while peasants labored in fields under the desert sun, their survival tied to the annual flood of the Nile. Nobles lived in grand estates, priests controlled temples and resources, and artisans carved monuments that still awe the world. Yet in death, all Egyptians, regardless of status, believed they would stand before the same judgment, the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Maat, this belief that kings and commoners alike faced divine justice was one of the most striking aspects of Egyptian religion. Though a pharaoh could be buried in a pyramid or a valley tomb adorned with gold, and a farmer laid to rest in a simple pit with a few modest offerings, both hearts were destined for the same scales. Eternity could not be purchased. It had to be earned in the Old Kingdom around 2600 BCE. The afterlife was initially seen as the privilege of kings. The pyramid texts, inscribed in royal tombs, described the pharaoh's ascent to the heavens to join the sun god Ra. Commoners expected little more than a shadowy continuation of existence. But over time, this exclusivity began to erode. By the Middle Kingdom 2000 BCE, the coffin texts extended afterlife promises to non-royals. By the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead made the weighing of the heart universal. Pharaohs and farmers alike recited the negative confession and faced Osiris. Judgment. Tomb inscriptions reveal how rulers adapted to this new equality. Pharaohs continued to emphasize their divine roles, but also portrayed themselves as moral men. Ramses II, for instance, had inscriptions declaring that he upheld Maat, defended the weak, and honored the gods. Kings did not claim exemption from judgment. Instead, they presented themselves as models of righteousness who would pass the scales. For common Egyptians, this universality was both empowering and daunting. A farmer harvesting grain knew his actions mattered not only for survival but for eternity. A merchant measuring barley understood that dishonest scales could weigh against his soul. Women raising children, artisans crafting tools, scribes recording taxes all believed their daily choices had eternal weight. Tombs of artisans in Deir el-Medina, the workers' village for the Valley of the Kings, often include inscriptions emphasizing honesty, devotion to family, and generosity to the poor. The idea that both kings and commoners stood before the scales also influenced Egyptian politics. Pharaohs were expected to embody Maat, not just in ritual but in governance. When they failed, when corruption, famine, or disorder struck, texts sometimes accuse rulers of neglecting Maat. The first intermediate period, around 2200 BC, was remembered as a time when Maat broke down and chaos ruled. The restoration of order was framed as the restoration of Maat, ensuring both societal stability and divine approval. Yet, despite this shared judgment, wealth did shape preparation for the afterlife. Pharaohs and elites could afford elaborate tombs, funerary, papyri, amulets, and statues. Commoners relied on simpler means, perhaps a single shabti figurine, a crude heart scarab, or a small offering table. Still, even these modest provisions reflected the belief that everyone faced the same trial. What mattered most was the heart's purity. The universality of judgment gave Egyptian society a moral foundation beyond class. Though inequality persisted in life, the promise of justice in death ensured that truth and balance were ultimate standards. This belief fostered continuity across millennia. Pharaohs might claim divinity, but they too awaited the verdict of the scales. Farmers might toil in obscurity, but their righteousness could win them eternity. For modern audiences, this vision of shared judgment is both humbling and inspiring. It shows that in a world of hierarchy, Egyptians imagined ultimate equality. In death, before Osiris, all stood as souls, stripped of wealth and power, measured only by truth. The vision of the weighing of the heart is not a modern reconstruction alone. It comes to us directly from the tombs, temples, and papyri left behind by the Egyptians themselves. Archaeology has uncovered a wealth of material evidence that brings the whole of Ammit to life. Painted papyri, carved reliefs, amulets, and inscriptions that illustrate the drama of judgment in astonishing detail. One of the most famous examples is the Papyrus of Ani, created around 1250 BCE during the 19th dynasty. This richly illustrated book of the Dead Scroll, more than 24 meters long, was commissioned by Ani, a royal scribe. It contains vivid scenes of the judgment hall, Ani led by Anubis, his heart weighed against the feather, Ammit crouched nearby, Thoth recording, and Horus presenting him to Osiris. This papyrus, now in the British Museum, is one of the most detailed windows into Egyptian beliefs. Every line of hieroglyphs, every stroke of paint, was intended to guide Ani safely through the afterlife. Other papyri confirm the consistency of this imagery. The Papyrus of Hunefer, slightly earlier, depicts similar scenes. Hunefer, an overseer of the royal treasury, is shown passing the judgment successfully, his heart balancing against Ammit feather. These papyri were not isolated works, but part of a widespread tradition. Dozens have been recovered from tombs, each customized for its owner but sharing the same central iconography. Tomb walls also preserve these visions. In the Theban necropolis, particularly in the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens, painted reliefs show judgment scenes alongside depictions of gods, protective spells, and scenes of paradise. Tomb KV62, the resting place of Tutankhamun, contained not only golden treasures but also protective amulets and inscriptions referencing the trial before Osiris. While the young king's tomb lacked large wall paintings, other royal tombs, as that of Seti, I display entire chambers filled with scenes of the afterlife. Archaeologists have also uncovered countless amulets connected to judgment. Heart scarabs, often inscribed with spell 3OB, appear in burials across social classes. These scarabs, placed over the chest, pleaded with the heart not to betray its owner in the hall. Some are made of fine green stone, others of simple faience, but all reflect the same fear and hope. Museums around the world now house these artifacts. The Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Cairo Museum all display papyri and objects depicting judgment. Visitors can see the artistry firsthand: delicate brushwork, precise hieroglyphs, and vibrant colors that have survived for over 3 millennia. These objects remind us that Egyptians took the trial with utmost seriousness. It was not metaphorical, but a lived expectation. Modern technology has deepened our understanding. CT scans of mummies reveal amulets hidden among wrappings, confirming textual accounts. Digital reconstructions of tomb paintings show how vivid colors once glowed under torchlight. Archaeologists at Deir el Medina have uncovered astruc fragments of pottery where scribes practiced copying passages from the Book of the Dead. Even in training, they rehearsed the texts that would guide souls through judgment. The consistency of these discoveries underscores the centrality of the weighing of the heart. Across centuries and dynasties, Egyptians returned to the same imagery. Osiris enthroned, Anubis at the scales, Thoth recording, Ammit waiting. The universality of these scenes reflects the universality of belief. Kings, officials, artisans, and farmers all carried the same vision of judgment into their tombs. For historians, these artifacts also reveal the social dimensions of belief. Commissioning a papyrus was expensive, yet demand was high. Workshops produced scrolls with blank spaces for names, later filled in for buyers. This suggests a thriving market for afterlife texts, accessible not only to elites, but to a broad middle class. The spread of judgment scenes illustrates how deeply the concept penetrated Egyptian society. The discoveries also confirm the Egyptians' artistic genius. The balanced scales, the careful rendering of deities, the precise hieroglyphs all show a civilization devoted to detail, meaning, and permanence. These were not mere decorations, but sacred tools, essential for survival beyond death. Ultimately, archaeology has given us more than objects. It has preserved the very hopes and fears of an ancient people. In papyri, amulets, and paintings, we see their conviction that life was accountable, that justice prevailed, and that eternity was possible. The judgment scenes are not relics of superstition, but testimonies of faith, morality, and the human desire for meaning. The Egyptian vision of judgment after death, most vividly expressed in the weighing of the heart, was not the only way ancient civilizations imagined the fate of the soul. Across the ancient world, cultures wrestled with the same question: what happens when life ends? By comparing Egypt's beliefs with those of Mesopotamia, Greece, and later Abrahamic religions, we can see both the uniqueness of Egypt's vision and the broader human search for meaning in mortality. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the afterlife was conceived in starkly different terms. The Sumerians and Babylonians imagined the dead descending to a shadowy realm called Kuwa or Urkala, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. Here, the dead lived on as dusty shades, deprived of joy or punishment, simply existing in gloom. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature, describes the underworld as a house where people eat clay and wear feathers like birds. There was no judgment, no reward for virtue or punishment for vice, only a bleak equality in shadow. Compared to the Egyptians' optimistic vision of balance and eternal life, Mesopotamia offered little hope. In Greece, beliefs evolved over centuries. Homer's epics, written around the 8th century BCE, describe Hades as a place of shadows, similar to Mesopotamian gloom. Achilles, in the Odyssey, laments that he would rather be a servant among the living than a king among the dead. Yet by the classical period, Greek philosophy and mystery religions introduced ideas of moral judgment. Plato, in his Republic, described souls judged after death, rewarded in the Isles of the Blessed or punished in Tartarus. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a happier afterlife, while Orphic traditions imagine cycles of reincarnation. These developments show Greece moving closer to Egypt's moral vision, where life's conduct determined fate beyond the grave. In the Hebrew Bible, written during the first millennium BCE, the afterlife was originally vague. Early texts describe Sheol, a shadowy place similar to Mesopotamian underworlds. Yet over time, particularly during the Second Temple period, Jewish thought began to incorporate concepts of judgment and resurrection, likely influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism and possibly Egyptian ideas. The notion of the righteous rising to eternal life and the wicked facing destruction echoes themes from the Egyptian Hall of Ammit. Christianity and Islam later built upon these traditions, envisioning detailed judgments after death. In Christian belief, the Last Judgment decides the eternal destiny of souls, with heaven and hell as ultimate outcomes. The imagery of scales appears in Christian art, with the Archangel Michael weighing souls, a striking parallel to Anubis. In Islam, the Quran describes the weighing of deeds on a scale, where righteous acts tip the balance toward paradise and sin leads to hellfire. Though separated by centuries, the echoes of Egypt's scales of Mat are unmistakable. Zoroastrianism, the religion of ancient Persia, also developed a moral afterlife. The Chinvat Bridge was imagined as a crossing each soul must attempt. For the righteous, the bridge widened, leading to paradise. For the wicked, it narrowed, plunging them into torment. This idea of a perilous passage based on moral worth bears resemblance to Egypt's courtroom, where truth or falsehood determined destiny. The uniqueness of Egypt lies in its balance of optimism and accountability. Unlike Mesopotamia's despair, Greece's evolving shadows, or early Sheol's vagueness, Egypt imagined a system where truth prevailed, justice ruled, and paradise was possible. The field of reeds was not reserved for elites alone, but open to all who lived in harmony with Mat. This universality gave Egyptian belief a powerful moral foundation that endured for 3 millennia. Modern scholars debate how much Egypt influenced later religions. Trade, conquest, and cultural contacts spread ideas widely in the ancient Near East. Greek thinkers like Herodotus recorded Egyptian customs, and Jewish communities lived in Egypt for centuries. It is difficult to trace direct lines of influence, but the parallels are undeniable. The image of scales weighing the soul or deeds appears across civilizations, suggesting a shared human intuition that life must be accountable, that justice must extend beyond death. For Egyptians, their version remained distinctive. They did not imagine cycles of reincarnation, eternal torment, or arbitrary fates. They envisioned a moral universe governed by balance. Truth was measurable, justice was impartial, and paradise reflected the land they knew best: fertile fields, abundant harvests, and eternal harmony. The vision of the weighing of the heart did not die with ancient Egypt. Though temples crumbled and languages faded, the core ideas of Mat, judgment, and eternal accountability echoed through later civilizations and still resonate in modern thought. They live in law, religion, philosophy, and even psychology. One of the clearest echoes is in religious imagery. In Christian art from the Middle Ages, the Archangel Michael is often shown holding a pair of scales, weighing the souls of the dead. This motif, widespread across Europe, bears striking resemblance to Anubis's role. Sometimes demons tug at the scales to tip the balance, while angels ensure fairness. Though rooted in Christian theology, the visual parallel with Egyptian imagery is unmistakable. The soul measured against truth. In Islam, the Quran describes the weighing of deeds on a scale during the Day of Judgment. Surah 21:47 states, "We shall set up scales of justice for the day of resurrection, so that no soul will be wronged in the least. The righteous enter paradise, the wicked are condemned." This concept of impartial measurement echoes the feather of Mat, adapted to a new religious framework. Even in Judaism, later traditions adopted ideas of posthumous judgment and reward. The Second Temple period saw beliefs in resurrection and divine justice grow, likely influenced by Persian and possibly Egyptian concepts. The notion that God records every deed and judges the soul parallels Thoth's role as divine scribe. Beyond religion, echoes of Mat appear in philosophy and law. The Greeks, who admired Egyptian wisdom, incorporated concepts of cosmic order into their philosophy. Plato's ideas of a just soul and universal harmony resonate with Matt's principles. The Stoics later taught that living in harmony with nature and reason was the path to virtue, a notion that parallels Egyptian emphasis on balance and truth. Modern legal systems also carry echoes. The image of scales as a symbol of justice is nearly universal today. Courthouses around the world display Lady Justice holding a balance, blindfolded to symbolize impartiality. While her roots lie in Greco-Roman traditions, the deeper symbolism that justice weighs truth is the same principle. The Egyptians envisioned over 3,000 years ago. The psychological legacy of the weighing of the heart endures as well. The idea that conscience holds a record of our deeds, that guilt weighs us down, and that truth ultimately emerges, is deeply embedded in human thought. Modern psychology speaks of the burden of guilt and the lightness of a clear conscience. These metaphors echo the imagery of the feather and the heart. Egyptians externalized this inner truth in divine form. Today, we still feel its weight within. Literature and popular culture also preserve the imagery. From Dante's Divine Comedy to modern films and novels, the idea of judgment after death remains a compelling theme. Scales, hearts, feathers, and divine courts appear again and again, showing how enduring the Egyptian vision has been. Scholars debate the extent of Egypt's influence on later traditions. Some argue that the imagery of scales developed independently in multiple cultures. Others point to centuries of contact through trade, conquest, and migration that allowed Egyptian ideas to flow into the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Whatever the case, the similarity of imagery suggests a shared human intuition that life should be accountable and justice should extend beyond death. In modern times, Maat has also been rediscovered as a philosophical ideal. African scholars and thinkers have revived her as a symbol of balance, truth, and harmony, connecting ancient Egyptian wisdom to contemporary discussions of justice and ethics. Maat is invoked not only as a historical curiosity, but as a timeless principle relevant to human societies today. The echoes of the weighing of the heart thus stretch far beyond Egypt's deserts and tombs. They live in our courts, our religions, our philosophies, and our conscience. The Egyptian's vision, rooted in the Hall of Marot, continues to remind us that truth matters, justice prevails, and every life carries weight. In the end, the Egyptian vision of the afterlife rests on a simple, profound image: a heart on one side of a scale, a feather on the other. For over 3,000 years, this image shaped the lives, hopes, and fears of millions. It defined their ethics, their rituals, their art, and their monuments. And though the civilization that created it has long vanished, the idea still endures. The Hall of Maat was more than myth. It was a reflection of Egypt's deepest values: truth, justice, and balance. It taught that every action mattered, that no life was exempt from judgment, and that eternity was not a gift, but a responsibility. Kings and commoners, rich and poor, powerful and humble, all stood before the same scales. The Egyptians found in this belief both fear and hope. Fear, because the threat of Ammit, the devourer, was real. To fail was to be annihilated, erased from memory and existence. Hope, because the field of reeds offered eternal abundance and peace to all who lived truthfully. The system was impartial, balanced, and just. This vision gave Egyptians stability in life. It encouraged honesty in trade, fairness in law, compassion in family, and responsibility in rulership. It shaped their society, reinforcing continuity across centuries of dynasties and invasions. It gave meaning to suffering and assurance against chaos. Above all, it promised that truth would prevail, even beyond death, today. Standing before the monuments of Egypt, we still feel the weight of this belief. The pyramids, the tombs, the papyri, and the mummies all testify to a people obsessed not with death, but with justice, order, and eternity. Their vision of the heart and feather continues to resonate because it speaks to something universal in the human condition. We too wrestle with questions of meaning, morality, and mortality. We too long for assurance that our lives matter, that justice exists, that truth will endure. The Egyptians answered with the Hall of Ammit. Whether we believe in their gods or not, the image remains powerful. Every heart carries weight. Every action is measured, and balance is eternal. As the feather glows against the heart, the question lingers across time. Is your heart light enough to pass?